Welcome to another edition of Table Talk, where we're privileged to have our guest Mark Hill with us for his second time, and this evening we're going to discuss the topic of why is there pain and suffering in the world, and linked with that it's going to be the question of why does God allow the pain and suffering in the world anyway. So we'll just start off with your thoughts. What are you thinking straight off the cuff?
Why is there pain and suffering?
Why is there pain and suffering in the world?
That's one of the big questions that a lot of people wonder about, especially non-Christians. And some Christians do. That why are we just suffering and enduring, and there's wars and different places, slavery still in different places, broken homes, murders and so on. And there's an answer for a Christian, but it's not necessarily an answer for the world, or it's definitely not an answer for anybody who believes in evolution or the theory of evolution. And for me, the answer that the Bible gives as a Christian makes sense. And that's the fact that this world wasn't created this way, and everything was really good and lovely, and unfortunately, we have no perception of what that is. Only Adam and Eve had that amazing, chance to see how perfect things could be. But when sin came into the world because of disobedience, then that brought in the punishment of, a curse of a fallen world and everything else that goes with it. And that again brings pain and suffering. So, living in a cursed world, in a broken world, and all the difficulties and problems that come in with sin.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, you linked suffering with God.
Mm-hmm.
If there is pain and suffering, and why does God allow it? So I think one of the first things we have to do is decide if there is a God. Mm-hmm. If there is no God, and people might say that there's all this suffering, how can there be a God? Well, if there is no God, does the suffering disappear? Mm. If I don't believe in God, am I going to suffer less? And so we have to decide first of all, if we're looking for a root of where pain and suffering is, does God exist first of all, if we want to put the blame on him? Now, if God doesn't exist, there's nowhere for me to go with that. I don't know why pain and suffering is there if there is no God. It just is, because we know it's there. And it isn't lessened by not believing in God. So from my point of view, and certainly in my experience of what we might call suffering, the conclusion I came to is that God does exist, because there is an answer to it, as Fumi said. But we've got to accept that God exists first of all if we're going to answer it from that viewpoint. If God doesn't exist, then it's still there, and why is it there?
And that's something I've come across with a lot of people, not all people, but a lot of people ask that question, aren't even believers. And so my first thought is, why are you trying to blame a God or ask a question of a God you don't even believe exists in the first place? I've always found that puzzling. But then again, there are some genuine Christians who ask the same question, and I don't think there's nothing wrong with that. It's an age-old question that, if anybody had a right to ask that question, it would be Job, with some of the things that he went through. But I've often thought about it this way: if somebody's not a Christian, how do they know that something is not right? How do they know that, unless there's a standard to go by? How do they know that the evil that exists in the world, if there is no God, well, how do they actually know that in the first place? To me, there has to be a standard, and people have to have the standard from somewhere to recognise that something's not right. There's something broken about our world, and whether you're a believer or not, I think most people would agree there's something wrong with the world. So my first question is, well, why where did that come from? And I think the Bible answers that question. I think it's in Romans, isn't it, when it talks about that God has written His laws in our hearts. So there's something in us that lets us know that something is not right. Or something is right, something is wrong. What do you think about
I
that?
think this is where those who believe in evolution theory, have to have a leap of faith, and even though they don't think that it's faith, because they're going from inanimate, non-living to multi-complex beings, and living things. And how do you make that jump? What is it that actually goes from, slime, elements to slime, to bacteria, to and plants, animal? How and then human, and as you say, what is it that then gives you that moral code, that moral standard, which animals don't have and plants definitely don't have? And this is where they come apart, because they don't know. And then they ridicule those who put their faith in a creator and says, actually, this is an answer of what you don't know, because they're saying it's Stephen Hawkins. I get Dawkins and Hawkins mixed up. That I think it's Stephen Hawkins, isn't it? They actually said that, evolution is just it's a random process, and that's the chance. It's we're just put together randomly. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just a blind indifference to our pain and suffering. It's here. That's it. Accept it. And when you're gone, you're gone. That's a roundabout, version of what he said. And well, what's the point of that? Why is my life such a random process that is so blindly indifferent to my sorrow and my pain? Why should I put my faith and my hope in that? How is that going to help anybody who's had their child murdered, or suffering from cancer, or whatever? And people, they say it with such boldness and such audacity that those who don't agree with it refrain from standing up to them and saying, yeah, but if there is no God, where does morality come from? If there is no God, where does good and evil come from? Because how do you know about good? Plants don't know about good. Animals don't know about good as such. So where did it then come into the evolutionary tree? Because you cannot add information. And they don't tell people that you can take information away, but you can't add brand new information code. It has to have been there from the start. And I think this is where you have to have a creator, an intelligent being that has set things in motion and has put their morality and their moral code into their creation, so that we can then, as beings who have been made in their image, in the image of the creator, we can then know right and wrong, obedience and disobedience, love and sadness, laughter and sadness, should I say. So the evolutionists know, you're lying to everybody and to yourself. And when we put God in the mix, it's like putting that mixing link, that mixing jigsaw into it to let people know that, hang on, yeah, there is right, there is wrong, but why is there, what's going on? And then when you put God in, you still have to have the right mirror of looking at God to make pain and suffering make sense, or else you then come up with, well, it's God's fault.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it, the way you said, where does that measure come from? And also, who said that God has got to make your life wonderful? Well, if we're going to have God, it's like we're trying to put onto God the way he should be and the way he should treat us. But if we're created, then it's up to him, it's not up to us. I'm currently too short for my weight. I need to grow a bit taller, and then if I grow a bit taller, I'm the perfect height for my weight. But I put weight on because I eat lots of the wrong things and sugary things, and I know that things shouldn't be eaten, and if I eat too much of them, I put weight on, and when I put weight on, I get health problems. Whose fault's that? Is it the doctor? You know, I'm going to blame the doctor. The doctor should have done this, that, or no, you knew this information and you still went ahead and did it. And I see that in the same way, that if there is a God, which I believe there is, rather than us dictating to God the way he should treat us, we know the way we should live. He's left a book for us to tell us all about him and be a manual for life. And if we stick with it, we're still going to suffer, because there's bad in this world. There are people who innocently go about their business and then suffer at the hands of other people, because there are people who do not stick to basically the main message of the Bible is to love God and to love others. And when we don't do that, then there's problems. So a lot of the suffering that comes about is because we don't do the things that we know are right to do. But then we get to disease. Whose fault is that? You know, now, like I said, some of my health problems might come because I've overeaten. I've done something that is going to lead to that, and we can see where that is. But then there's other people that live quite a healthy life and then they're stricken with a disease. And these are the things that we don't understand. We think someone is innocent, why do the innocent suffer, and all this kind of thing. But ultimately, the world isn't innocent. There are people that are out for what they can get. Not all people are bad people, but they don't acknowledge God as creator. And so because we have drifted away from God, there's bad in the world. There's illness and there's sickness. I mean, a lot of things can be traced to things that have happened that has been mankind's own making, with the various things, experiments and things that we've tried to do. You know, illness as a result of experiments maybe that have gone wrong and all that kind of thing. Maybe it's a lifestyle choice of a way to live in which diseases are passed on that could be eradicated if people didn't live an immoral life. I'm not saying that it would be completely eradicated, but certainly it could be cut down. So a lot of the suffering that comes about is because we're not doing what we need to do to make sure that these things aren't continuing.
And that's part of the the problem, isn't it? It's easy to play the blame game and point our fingers at everybody else, but until we learn to look at ourselves and ask myself, what am I doing in this that's making the place full of, you know, pain and suffering? What is my actions doing that's causing this as well? Because we ultimately have to take some responsibility, and that to me is where a lot of people are lacking. They're happy to blame others, they're happy to blame this, that and the next thing, but they're not happy to look at themselves and think, well, what part am I playing in this whole thing? Because then it comes back to, well, your moral standards are different from mine. We were having a Bible study one night in Liverpool, and we were talking about stealing, and it came up, somebody said, well, I just steal from Tesco's because they could afford it. Tesco's can afford it. So I said, okay, I said, let's take your argument. What happens if somebody breaks into your house and steals your television? Oh, that wouldn't be right. I said, but you can afford to get another television. Oh, that's different. I'm like, no, where is it different?
Yeah.
Because it's like your standards against everybody else's standards there'd never be any firm standard, if you wish, because everybody's got different standards for one another. So what you think is evil, somebody else might not think it's that bad. But the thing is with these questions, they're big, deep questions. You know, why do, you know, babies die when they're young? You know, why did so and so have to get cancer, and all these big questions? Why is there wars going on in the world? I think the war side of things could be answered through the, you know, the self power and all that hungry type thing. But there's a lot of other stuff in there that's like, I don't think we fully grasp. I don't think we fully understand. But we can get a little glimpse when we look to what God allowed his son to go through. Because if he didn't suffer, then there would be no Christianity. If he didn't suffer on the cross, then we'd be as well just calling it a right. And so there's something in suffering that brings out good. And I think we see that with Jesus coming to die in our place.
I think two things. One, the fact that the Creator would painstakingly be involved in our pain and suffering to actually help us to alleviate it in a permanent way by being saved and being in Him, but also to let us know how much He loves us and how much He wants to help us through our difficulties and our trials and our pain and our suffering. Because if He's gone through it, then He has more of an empathy. From our point of view, we come to realize He loves us and He has more of an empathy towards us, because He knows what pain is, He knows what suffering is. After His Son went, as a father, His Son went through the cross and all the pain of it, and it's Jesus Himself having to go through all that, and the way people attacked Him and wanted to kill Him, and and I think that is so important to recognize that God is not far away, this great big Creator who's far removed, that do whatever you want, I don't care. But no, He's right there in the mix with us, strengthening us, helping us if we want Him to, and He's always been there. And at the same time, He is the answer, the way for us to deal with this situation and give us a purpose, and know that after we live this life, we would have something better as long as we put our trust and our hope in Him and walk with Him. So there's something to look forward to be able to endure the pain and suffering. But more importantly, our pain and suffering and our difficulties are not a waste. Whatever I've gone through in my life, was it a couple of days ago, somebody was saying to me that, you'd like to go back, he says, it was my birthday, happy birthday, it's belated, and then said, 30 again, and I said, no, I don't want to go back to being 30. I've already lived all that life and lived all the difficulties, the trials and the joys of it. I don't want to go back because I'll have to live it all again. I've gained some wisdom, some experience. I don't need to go back. I enjoy where I am. And that's the thing of the difficulties and the pain. You gain experience, you gain to persevere, you gain to endure, and you grow through it. And God helps you through it. And you're able to help somebody else who's coming behind and is going through it. So there's purpose to our pain, even though it's not, at the time, it's not enjoyable for us.
And I think it comes back to Mark, we were talking about this earlier, where there's a lot of people who say, become a Christian and your life will become pain-free. You'll have a wonderful existence without... that's a lie straight off the bat.
Yeah.
And a misrepresentation of God, I think.
Well, look at those that were closest to Jesus, and all but one died horrible deaths.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd think, well, after all they did, after all they went through, why did they suffer that? And there's lots of, throughout the Old Testament, those who spoke on behalf of God, the persecution, the deaths that they suffered at the hands of people who didn't like the message that was being given. So there is nowhere there is a guarantee that your life's going to be wonderful just because you serve God, and that shouldn't be the goal. All the people that are complaining about why has God not stopped the suffering, and it's trite to say this because it's difficult when you are suffering, but would you look upon God differently if you didn't suffer? Would you want to follow Him? Would you want to worship God? Would you want to give your life over to God if your life was perfect and everything was great? As much as people, when we see suffering in the world, ask, where's God? What about the folks that life's wonderful for? Do they say, God has blessed me in this way, or where's God when this went right? We don't view it that way. It's just like he's a punch bag for when things go wrong, when there's no other way we can see of placing the blame on anyone or anything.
Yes.
Because it's like that and the Bible says that he sends the sun and the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And you never hear anybody stop on it and say, thank you, Father, for the sun and the rain. You never hear that side of things. But somebody said to me not long ago, why doesn't God do something about it? And my answer to that is, he has. He sent his son 2,000 years ago to deal with the pain and suffering that's going on in the world, because he recognised it. In fact, it troubled him so much that God had to become man to experience life, humankind, and the pain and suffering. And so, like you said earlier, he knows all about it. But the other side is, there's also coming a time when he comes back, and there will be no more pain, there will be no more suffering. That will come to an end there. So we have these promises that God isn't far away and looking down and letting us get on with it. He's dealing with it. We just don't see him dealing with it. And we don't see him dealing in the way that people want God to deal with it. Because like you said, if God was just to go, well, no more pain and suffering, would anybody else turn? Because to me, I've had somebody, a few people said, well, if Jesus showed up to me today, then I would definitely believe. And I'm thinking, what makes you think you'd believe? He showed up 2,000 years ago, and
when he
people
was on
didn't.
the earth, yeah. Or they followed him for a while, and when it sounded like it was going to get tough, then give up. I mean, I really do. That point you made at the beginning as well, or was it yourself? What degree of suffering is suffering? How do you measure it? Is it someone who's got a terminal illness, or is it that person that didn't make it into the team so they could become a professional footballer?
Yeah.
Was that suffering? Which one is suffering? Suffering is relative, because for some people, marrying that person, or like I said, not making it. I knew someone who stopped attending church when I was younger because they had got their heart set on a particular career and had failed one exam, and that was God's fault, and so they didn't want to go anymore because they prayed that they pass. Is that suffering? What do we mean by suffering? What degree of suffering is God's fault? How much is our own fault? Ultimately, I think suffering, we don't want it. It doesn't ought to be there, but it being there makes us realise there's something more than this life has got to offer.
Yeah.
And sometimes people recognise that even if the life goes right. Some people recognise it when things go wrong, but ultimately it's all about letting us know that this life is not all there is. If it is, then it is just about having a happy life and then you die, and that's useless as far as I'm concerned as well. Who's to say what is that good life that you can lead and be satisfied at the end of it if all we do is live and then we die? Some people suffer more than others, but what's it all about? There's got to be a greater being than ourselves, and there's got to be a purpose beyond this life. Because there's some people, I don't know how they cope, but they go from one tragedy to the next, and they still manage to continue to be an encourager for other people. Then others, there's a less serious form of suffering, and the world's come to an end and it's awful, and woe is me because this has happened. What degree of suffering is really suffering? And it's all of it, I think, is to direct us to the fact that there's more to this life.
Yeah. And it comes back to, again, like you keep saying, if you when you come to accept that God exists and that God created all things, you read the Genesis story and you see the fall of mankind, what happened with Adam and Eve, and sin into the world, death into the world. The world itself was going to be troubled as well, affected by Adam and Eve's sin. And so from there you start to see a decay happening, not only in humans but in the world that we're living in just now. And so to me that's the only thing that makes sense of why there is pain and suffering in the world. Why does God allow it to go on? Again, I think it may come back to what you're talking about. Kind of faith would it be if there was none? If there was no pain and suffering, you know, like you said earlier, how can we grow in our through our difficult times? There's going to be none of that, because to me that's one of the biggest differences between Christians and non-Christians. You've got two sets of people going through the exact same scenario, and yet one set of people seem to rise above the circumstances. And to me, that's because there's a purpose behind it. If there's a purpose behind something, you know, then that's going to help you understand, rather than thinking, well, why is this happening to me? You're looking at it and thinking, well, what's going on here? What is God trying to teach me, if He's trying to teach me anything through here? All of that sort of thing. But it will come to an end when there's that beautiful passage in Revelation, isn't it, where those who had been slain before for the word of God, they're like, how long, sovereign Lord, how long are you going to let this happen to avenge your blood? And God just mercifully smiles and says, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it. He tells them to wait. And that's from a Christian perspective, you know, my ways are not your ways, God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, God said. So, and then through all of this, we can't remove the reality that pain and suffering is real and difficult, but it hits everybody. Christians are not exempt from this. I think the difference is that we acknowledge our guilt, our part, our blame, if you wish, in all of this. But the other side, we're looking at it through, trying to look at it through God's eyes, and knowing that this is going to have an expiry date. We're going to get through this, and where we're going next is way better than where we are now.
I think that why have we got pain and suffering? Our fault, not God's. We wanted, He gave choice, and everything was good. Right at the beginning, there was choice, because He wanted us to choose to love Him and to have a relationship with Him, and to have that understanding. That's why we have intelligence, to have that understanding of what love is, and appreciate it and show it not only to Him but also to each other. Now, if God should stop pain and suffering, He would have to stop choice, because we choose to do good and we choose to do bad. We choose to help somebody, or we choose to ignore their pain and not help them, or we choose to actually be the ones that cause the pain and suffering. So if God should stop pain and suffering, He would have to stop choice. And He's not going to do that, because He's inbuilt that into us, because He wants us to be, He made us in His image and in His likeness. And as I always say, with more choice comes much responsibility and much accountability. So while, you know, we live in a sinful world, we live in a world that has pain, suffering. Question is, what are we doing with our pain and suffering? What are we doing with other people's pain and suffering that comes our way? When you get a text message that says, we haven't been able to contact my sister or my daughter, or my daughter's in hospital, or this or that has been murdered. Where does compassion? Compassion has to come in. That's a good thing. That's one of the things God gave us, So we need to stop looking at just the negative. We have to look at the whole picture. Where there's pain and suffering, there's also a lot of humanitarian efforts. There's also a lot of kindness. There's also a lot of love. There's all that. God has put that in place. If there is no God and we just have pain and suffering, we're in big trouble. We're in big trouble, because that means there's no hope. We're not talking about eternal life. We're talking about now. There is no hope, because people are going to be in it for themselves. And so we have the choice to choose how we're going to help alleviate other people's pain and suffering, or support them through it if we can. And also, what can we do about our own pain and suffering? Are we just going to sit there and say, woe is me? Or are we going to try and rise above it? And I think Job is the perfect example for us. He had everything, lost everything. But because he did not give up on God, and because he knew the type of God he served and believed in, things in the end, it took a long while, but in the end things got better for him. But he had to endure all that pain and suffering. And you know, when he wanted to know, why am I pain, why am I suffering? And what have I done wrong that I should be going through this? God never answered him and say, this is why. Because he is creator.
But that's an interesting point, isn't it? That in the book of Job, remember you taught that not long ago, Satan is the one who's behind us.
Yeah.
And I've yet to hear anybody put, why is there pain and suffering in the world? Satan.
Yeah.
I never hear anybody, not one person, saying it's his doing. He's part of it. But it's always God's fault, if he exists, type thing. You know, I always find that side of it quite an interesting thought.
If you believe in God, you've got to believe in Satan. There's this opposite.
Yeah.
So why is it not Satan's fault? And why are you wanting to stay in Satan's kingdom rather than be part of God's kingdom? There's pain and suffering. There is pain and suffering in the world, but there's also God. And because of that, there's hope. Because this isn't the only life we live in. If God does not exist, there's still pain and suffering in the world. The difference is there's no hope. Because all you do is suffer pain to one degree or another, and then you die. And then what? So it's for me, as difficult and as hard as it is, it's better to, not better, it's the wrong word, but you know, it's preferable that God is there and you have that pain and suffering than God isn't there. And if he does away with pain and suffering, how do you know you got a good life? What are you comparing it to?
Yeah.
So then suddenly they've got more than me, and so you're still going to end up with this is unfair, they've got more than I have, and we might not have the pain and suffering, but we'll figure out some other way of showing that life's unfair. Life isn't fair. And God didn't say, you know, come follow me, or Jesus didn't say, come follow me and life will be fair. It's not about that. It's about trusting your Creator and knowing that there's something more than this life. If there's not something more than this life, then as Paul said, we're to be pitied. Because this life can be good for a lot of people, but so many people suffer. And if there's no God, there's no hope.
Yeah, and I think again, like you assumed that God could have easily created us as robots and programmed us, do not hurt each other, you shall obey me and nobody else. But like you mentioned then when we were chatting about this, people would still then complain that God hasn't given us any free will type thing. So for God is in a no-win situation for a lot of people around. But again, until you understand God in his perspective, looking at it from his perspective, then it makes the difference between having a reason to live, but also to having a reason to die. Whereas if God doesn't exist, then what's the point? What's the point of pain and suffering? What's the point of anything? You know, because we just hurt each other and hurt each other and hurt each other, and it's, well, what's the point anyway? Type thing, you know.
Well, that's the teaching of evolution, isn't it? The survival of the fittest, and the weak need to be got rid of to make way for the strong. Well, there's pain and suffering for someone perpetrated by someone that thinks they're better than someone else. It's a false philosophy, and it doesn't work to make the world a better place. It makes it worse, because they're trying to live without God, and where's that got everyone?
Yeah.
There's just more suffering. You know, there's whole countries that have tried to take God out of the picture, and funny enough, those are places where there's probably more Christians than anywhere else, because under that regime they realise there is something more than this.
Yeah.
You know, when we get quite comfortable and think we can do without God, that's when we're in trouble. And so to have something that kind of pulls you up by the bootstraps to say, this life is not all there is, there's more to it than this.
And I think, again, go back to what we were discussing earlier today, I think some people have a genuine got qualms with when it comes to religion. You know, I think a lot of bad things have been done in the name of religion.
Yeah.
And people tend to then sort of paintbrush every single aspect of any type of religion as the same as evil, in terms of, oh, look what religion's done here, it caused this war, caused that war, did that and the other thing. And for me it's like, well, I understand that a lot of things are done bad in the name of religion, but please don't brand every single religion the same brush, and especially don't brand every single Christian with the same brush, because we're not all like that type thing. Some of us value life, some of us, you know, try to live a life that pleases God, and that's where it gets mixed up there, and you can see why people would be angry. If there's a God that exists, why would you tell your people to do A, B, C, D, like that? But like I said, God isn't telling people to go out and start wars and things like that. He's not doing that today. That comes from the power-hungry side of things.
And that's a choice thing. People are choosing to do that. But it's easier to use God as the umbrella or canopy or the front to say, you know, God has sent us, and you know, our leaders have said this, and therefore we are going to go ahead and do it. But no, God says, love your neighbor as yourself. If you love somebody else as you love yourself, you don't want to be hurt, you don't want to be kidnapped, you don't want to be tortured, you don't want somebody stealing from you. So don't do that to somebody else. Imagine if we all, as you said, if we all followed that code, how wonderful and bold we was, because we choose, and something you said, which is true. Where is Satan in all of this? Because he's camouflaging very well. Not only do we have selfish desires and wrong desires, but he knows our weaknesses, and he will tempt us. Satan and the other fallen angels will tempt us, you know, and goad us to do what is wrong, to our detriment. And then we blame God, who is the answer and the solution. That doesn't make sense.
If I could recommend a film to watch, it would be the Shark. I don't know if you've ever seen it before.
Yeah.
Brilliant, powerful film where a guy is married, got kids, and one of his kids gets sort of murdered, mutilated if you wish, and he gets this letter from God, if you wish, to go and visit God. So he goes to visit God, and obviously it's all made up, but there's a part in the film where he's got to meet Justice, and Justice is sitting on the throne, and they're having a conversation, and he's saying, this person needs to go to hell, that person needs to go to hell, this person needs to go to hell. So Justice says, okay, so you think it's easy being God, sitting in the justice seat? He says, yeah, I know who needs to go and who doesn't. So they swap places. And then Justice says, Justice brings up his other son and his other daughter. He says, right, choose. Which one's going to hell? He said, this one has been lying through their teeth about how they're feeling. This one has been up to something else. Both of them are sinning. Which one do you want to send to hell? And it was a very powerful moment in the film where he more or less come down off the seat and said, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And the idea was, you know, if people think it's easy to sit in God's place and make judgments about this, that and the next thing, but the reality is God gets no enjoyment out of that. He gets no enjoyment out of watching people suffering. None. He hates it. But he has to allow it to go on for us to have that exercise, that free will. And until we make that decision to follow Jesus completely, if you wish, it's just going to continue. It's going to continue.
Well, when God came to earth as Jesus, I don't read anywhere where Jesus struck anyone down with an illness or a disease to teach them a lesson. He only ever cured people. And there's an account where 10 lepers came to him and he cured them all. One came back to say thank you,
Yeah.
the others just carried on with their life. So if suffering is removed in that way, why didn't those people turn to Jesus after
Yeah.
what he'd done? There's no guarantee that if your life's going to be fine, you're going to serve God. There's no guarantee if you suffer, you won't serve God. There's just no rhyme or reason to an individual suffering very often. But ultimately, if there is no God, there is no hope at all, you just suffer and that's it. If there is a God, then there's more to come, there's more to look forward to. We can get away from this life and be in a place where there is no more suffering. And it's these things that alert us to the fact that this is a pathetic world and we've got something better to go to.
Yeah. And as somebody once said, just to finish up, that we won't appreciate just how special heaven's going to be until we experience how bad it is without it. It's the contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of one against the other. Anyway, was you going to say something before we finish up?
Just a final thing. It's about the fact that when we put God in the mix, the recognition that there will be justice at the end of time, that God is not only a loving God, a God who provides, a God who helps us through the difficulties of life, but he also is a righteous judge. He judges rightly, he sees all things and judges correctly, and at the end there will be a judgment. And so instead of relying on evolution or nothingness, where people, you think, oh well, what's the point, because people who have done evil, that's it, they're going to go scot-free. No, there is justice at the end, but it's not just justice for those whom we deem are the murderers or the evil people, it's justice for everybody. So again, it comes back down to, what am I doing with my choice? What am I doing with my life? And am I living the right way that God is expecting me to live? Because I am going to be given an account. I'm responsible for it, and I have to give an account for what I've been doing with the gift of life that He's given to me. And I would say, let's just keep loving God, trusting Him and serving Him, and He will help us through the difficult times. And it's not His fault, it's our fault, it's Satan's fault, but not His fault.
Yeah, that's one of the most powerful sides of the whole discussion as well, is that there's pain and suffering and people are looking for justice. And sometimes people squeeze through the justice system and get away with things. But there is no cracks in God's justice system. Either come Judgment Day, it'll be the day of accounting, and you know, whether you got away with things here on planet Earth, justice will be done, it'll be served. So yeah. So anyway, thank you very much for joining us again. Thank you again for Mark being with us, and thank you again for Fumi. We will see you again soon. God bless you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.